Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Debatable Discussions podcast. And today we're joined by a special guest.
So yes, today we are joined by Robin's Reverie. Robin is an Englishman currently living in Italy and also a graduate of Durham and Oxford University. As shown by his Instagram, which is followed by several thousand, he enjoys writing, Italian culture and art, amongst many other things.
So we're going to begin with a question about art. So who's your favorite artist and maybe a piece of artwork from them as well?
Okay, so that's a great question because, as you've mentioned already, I'm quite fascinated by art history, and it was quite a large focus of mine at university and just in general life as it is. And I think I've got one artist in particular who reigns supreme, and that's Caravaggio. Um, I sort of fell in love with him in my first year at university, having sort of heard of him before, as many people have done, but never having really studied his art. And since discovering him, I just find that any time that his name is mentioned or that I see an exhibition of his, either in London, in Italy, or wherever it may be in the world, given that his paintings are everywhere, all over the globe, I just get very excited. His artwork, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, is characterized by chiaroscuro, the sort of difference or the sort of contrast between the dark and the light. So a lot of his paintings seem to be in a sort of studio setting, a dark room where the figures are prominent, but there's not so much focus on irrelevant details in the background. Now, he was heavily criticized for this sort of technique by many of his contemporaries, but most viewers of his work today are able to appreciate the spotlighting effect that this technique brings and how it sort of allows you to focus very much on the inner sort of turmoil or disgust or whatever emotion he's trying to display in each of his characters or his figures, should I say. I think there are a number of his which I would list off as my favourite, but if I were to choose one, and this is difficult because I do love so many of them, it would potentially be Doubting Thomas. In this painting, Thomas is in front of Christ, and from the biblical story, he doesn't believe that it could possibly be him. So Christ tells him to touch his wound, the stigmata, and so Thomas does so. And it's sort of in this moment, as Thomas is putting his finger into the wound, that he realizes Christ's existence. And the physiognomy of this painting, the gestures, all of the expressions combined make it so fascinating for anybody who's interested in affect theory, which is, the study of emotions and such things as that, or anybody who's an artist or an art appreciator in general. It's a fascinating painting. It's very simple, as I say again. The background is pretty much just black, but you feel really sucked in as Thomas puts his finger into the paint, into the wound. You're almost sucked into the painting with him, and I think that's one of the things that I've really appreciated about Caravaggio while studying him is his interest and focus on bringing the viewer into the scene. Now, that's primarily, or it could be argued that that's primarily because he was painting after the Council of Trent, where during the Counter-Reformation, the church, the Catholic Church, that is, wanted artists to engage with the viewer to allow illiterate viewers to understand the Bible and biblical stories. Caravaggio took this very literally and again was heavily criticized at times for this, but he almost ensured that the average, churchgoer or the average man was able to understand what was happening through playing with their emotions and sucking them into the scene. There are many such paintings where he plays with angles and dimensions in such a way that you are drawn into it. And I think as well, the focus on blackness also does that because you're not consumed by this sort of spatial dimension that you can't really connect with. You're just looking at the figures in this vast expanse of blackness. I think that's one of the reasons that I really do like Caravaggio is his connection to normal people, and that can be shown again by the fact that when he was painting saints, he would use again, heavily criticised for this. He would use prostitutes from the street. He would use bar goers. He would use anybody he could find to model. And this maybe was quite irreligious at the time, and you can certainly see why the church was frowning upon it from their point of view back then. But it just sort of makes him, in a way, a man of the people. He wasn't a very nice man, that can be said, but his art is able to be appreciated universally, irrespective of culture or the period in which you're living. I don't know if you guys are familiar with anything by Caravaggio and if you have anything to say on this, but that's sort of why, in short, I appreciate his art so much.
Yeah, we definitely are familiar with Caravaggio. I mean, we've discussed
Yeah,
him at school even because his paintings, really, for me, are quite sort of dramatic and exciting. And when I sort of started to get interested in art, which wasn't too long ago, as you sort of talked about there, Robin, they sort of pull you in because of that contrast you get between like the light and the dark. It creates that sort of very dramatic effect, and that really just made me quite interested in him because it wasn't sort of something. Am I right in saying that from that period, there weren't really at all many painters like him?
No, precisely. In fact, he triggered a whole wave after him of Caravaggisti, the artists who followed this technique of light and dark. But prior to that, it was very much an unknown technique. You know, everybody was obsessed with the techniques of the High Renaissance of perfect perspective and having backgrounds that were elaborate and ornate in many ways. And he came and completely changed that. And if you were to go to any Italian exhibition from the 17th century, so many painters follow Caravaggio's style. And I think that's a testament to the fact that it is a profound way of showing human emotion. I think he puts more focus on the figures in these paintings than any other artist up until his day ever really did, in my
yes. I
personal opinion.
also think thinking back on his painting of Medusa, which is hugely famous. A lot of people have seen that one. I think you can just feel a lot of things looking at that painting, which in many depictions of Medusa you can't. It's very blank, but there you can almost sense the
Absolutely.
desperation and the scariness of the
Absolutely.
character in question. I'd say even.
Yeah, precisely. And it's the same for so many of his paintings. That's a great example that a lot of art historians who focus on Caravaggio like to go to is Medusa, because as you say, it's one where you really truly get a feeling of emotion in her face. And that can be said for many of his other paintings, such as another one in the Uffizi where Isaac is about to be killed by his father. The desperation in the young boy's face is so heart wrenching. And Caravaggio has a really great skill of understanding how the face displays inner emotions. And yeah, for that reason, along with many others, I would say Caravaggio is my favorite. I could give a long list of other artists that I like, but that could go on for hours. But Caravaggio, I think, for anybody who wants a sort of good entry point into art history, he's a good place to start because even if you know nothing about art history, you can somewhat tell that he's doing something different.
This quite nicely moves on to our next question, and that is why do you believe that studying art and the history of art is important and relevant?
Yeah, I think this is obviously something that can be quite personal, and some people have reasons for doing it that I may not understand or you may not understand. But I think that doesn't matter as long as you've got your reasons. But from a more sort of general perspective, I think the importance of art history is that artists are capturing the human condition at the time in which they're painting. Whether they're painting a battle, a portrait, a still life, you name it, they're painting something that was prevalent to them and probably in many ways to society at the time. If you look at Turner's paintings of seascapes or like industrial the industrial period in contrast to his seascapes and things such as that, you have to ask yourself why these were the scenes that he decided to depict. And by sort of asking these questions of why and so on, you can get to know a time period a lot better. And, historians obviously often look at texts, at manuscripts, at all these sort of written documents, and they are obviously important for studying history. But you can't forget the importance of the material object. Artists, by their very nature, tend to be quite pensive people. And so they're going to put on a canvas something that really matters to them. So from that point of view, I think it's important because it allows you to understand history a lot better. But another reason that I think art history is so important is because of what it does to you as the viewer, and that's something that is, as I say, very personal. If I go tomorrow to the National Gallery and stand in front of Botticelli's Venus and Mars, it would elicit something in me that it might not elicit in you. Same goes for when you're reading a book. It's a very personal feeling, but whereas when you're reading a book, you might have to make more of a proactive effort to understand. You have to actually read the words and consume them. When it comes to art, the study of art history is different because you are sort of looking and being a bit of an investigator and trying to find different details. But when you just go to a gallery and you look at a painting, it sometimes, if the artist is a very good artist, it does the work for you. Um, there's something quite interesting that I don't know if you've come across before, which is the Stendhal effect,
Could you explain
Stendhal
that?
syndrome.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So Stendhal, the writer, wrote about going to the Uffizi in Florence and also going around the churches in Florence, and how on one of the occasions he was so struck by what he saw in a painting or a piece of art that he basically fainted. He had a bodily reaction to the art that he saw. Now, this has now been something that a few psychiatrists and psychologists have tried to study. It's not proven, but there are many cases of tourists going to Florence and being so overwhelmed by what they see that they actually have some kind of corporeal reaction to the artwork. And whether or not it's due to something like jet lag after having traveled a long way and getting there and being tired, or it's to do with expectation or anything like that, I think the point is whether or not the Stendhal syndrome is a genuine syndrome, art has the capacity to make you feel something. It has a capacity in many ways to, if a soul exists, to touch your soul. I've had times where I've looked at a painting and been lost for words. Then when you try to take it from a art historian's perspective and actually start talking about the painting, you can find that there is a lot you can say about it. But that initial reaction of being lost in the painting is almost a feeling of inebriation in many ways. And I think that's why, even if you don't take art history seriously as a discipline, you should definitely take it seriously as a pastime by going to galleries or, you know, following accounts on social media that explain art history. You learn so much from the discipline that maybe people aren't aware of because it's not really readily taught in secondary school. It is, we study history as a core subject, but we don't study art history. And I think it's a shame, really. I understand that there's only so much time that can be put towards things on a school curriculum. But in Italy, for example, art history is part of the curriculum. And I can see why. I mean, it tells you so much about the society in which you live, it tells you so much about the human condition. And I think, as with many other of the arts, music, theatre, anything like that, they hold such an important part. They help. They're so important to who we are as people. We're creative. Throughout history, we've created so many wonderful things, and it would be a shame to not reflect upon them.
Yes. So moving on now is to broadly our second section. We also talk about something that depicts society, which is literature, also hugely important. So
Yeah.
could you tell us your favorite author and maybe, again, a book that, I don't know, changed the way you think maybe, or that just left a mark on you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently. There are a number of authors that have, in recent years, really left a mark on me. And I think for many years, I would say that my favorite book was Fiesta by Ernest Hemingway, and I would implore everybody to read that. I think it's a wonderful book from the 20th century, and it tells you a lot about being an individual in a society that maybe doesn't fit your sort of your mold. But whilst I would implore everyone to read that, I think last year I read for the first time The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Now, it was almost surprising to me that I hadn't read it until last year, but in many ways I'm glad I hadn't, because I was very happy to be able to truly understand it at an age where I actually cared about what was being said. The reason that I would say The Picture of Dorian Gray had an impact upon me in a way that I almost can't describe is because every line of Oscar Wilde's work you could almost underline. Almost every line tells you something about humanity, but it's not sort of convoluted, it's not contrived. It seems very honest and true, and it seems as though Oscar Wilde is just telling you his views on humanity as he writes this wonderful novel. But another reason that I think I like it so much is that um, in your early 20s, you start to really battle with what it means to be an adult and what it means to be young versus old, and what aging really means in general. Does it mean trying to find success? Does it mean trying to be a bon vivant and living life to the full? All these questions come to the forefront when you're in your 20s. And this book is sort of inherently about youth. I won't spoil anything for those of you who haven't read it, but you'll know within the first 2 pages of reading the book that the protagonist wants to preserve his beauty, his youth, but there are complications with doing so. And I think when reading The Picture of Dorian Gray, you're really confronted with these questions of youth. Another writer who recently I've been reading quite a bit of, who deals with this, is Evelyn Waugh, who wrote Brideshead Revisited, Decline and Fall, and the book I read most recently by him was Vile Bodies. And Vile Bodies is a very interesting one because it's written about predominantly London in the post-war period, and the young people who are trying to reclaim their youth, having lost many of their years to the war, even if they weren't necessarily fighting in it. And I think that's somewhat relevant to our generation post-COVID. Is where we lost a couple of years of our youth to this sort of strange period, and I think it's definitely something that you can find when reading Vile Bodies. You can find similarities to our own day and age, and I think that's one of the beauties of literature in general. Is you could read anything from the 20th century, the 19th century. You could read something by Socrates. It doesn't really matter. There will be universal truths or universal ideas that still touch us today. And I think it's important for our generation and future generations to consider writing their ideas, because it could be useful for somebody in the future. I don't know if you have any friends who write, or if you yourselves ever write down your ideas or journal or write poetry or anything of the sort. I just think it's so important that people do so. And I hope that the rise of technology doesn't stop people from doing that, that we don't rely too heavily upon this, and that we maintain our creativity. Because as I've already mentioned, I think one of the beauties of humans is that we're creative. That's sort of, in many ways, what distinguishes us from other animals is our creativity.
I say I totally agree with you there, about how sort of whether it's literature or art, you sort of get to almost go into a different realm, a different world, which whilst it's distinct and interesting, has these sort of similarities. And also going back to Oscar Wilde, I've actually never
Yeah,
read a
neither.
book by him. However, of my limited knowledge of him, about how he's quite flamboyant, isn't he? Sort of stands out from society. Thinking about that, it does sort of interest me to read The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I haven't read yet, because he clearly was different to sort of society at the time.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that is most charming about him is that he was different, and he was unashamedly different. He was happy to put out these ideas, even though they were often, you know, criticized. And it's the same as what I was saying about Caravaggio. He was criticized. A lot of the great artists are criticized for what they do, but their work is so wonderful because it sort of it isn't always going alongside the status quo. And a lot of Wilde's works are actually very short, so they're very accessible. And although he is flamboyant and he uses very flowery language, it's not inaccessible. And I think anybody who has any interest in literature or culture or history should go to Oscar Wilde, because he just has a beautiful way of encapsulating these passions of mind, which I know so many people, such as yourselves, share. And it's always exciting when you come across a new writer. As like you, I hadn't read Oscar Wilde until last year, and since then I've picked up quite a lot of his works, his plays, and things such as that. And it's always exciting to come across a new writer, because you do realise that there's so much literature out there to consume, and it's well worth going for those sometimes that you haven't tried, rather than just sticking to the ones you know. And yeah, I definitely suggest picking up The Picture of Dorian Gray when you next can. I was maybe a bit scared to do so when I was younger, because I didn't know if it was maybe just going to be very gothic and, you know, dark, but actually it's not. That's really not the focus. So definitely
I also have a
suggest you that.
follow-up question. Could you point maybe an Italian author as well, keeping in the theme of Italy, an Italian author, either modern or less modern?
Absolutely. So within that sort of discussion to do with people like Oscar Wilde, I would point out a writer called Luigi Pirandello. Pirandello writes mainly about selfhood and identity and what it means to be you. One of his books, which would loosely translate to um, One Nobody and 100,000 or something along those lines, is about a man who wakes up one day, is looking in the mirror, and realizes from a comment from his wife that his nose actually turns in a different direction to the way he thought it did. And it shoots him down this whole existential crisis of what it means to be him, because he realizes that all his life he's felt that his nose went one way, she feels it goes another, and he starts thinking about what people think about him and what that means for his notion of selfhood. So the title One Nobody and 100,000 is basically the indication in Pirandello's mind that either one of us exists, our true self, nobody exists, there's no such thing as self, or like 100,000 or infinite selves exist. Now, that is to say that if I'm walking down the street thinking to myself, I have my idea of who I am, you know, that's me. But the person who walks past me and just sees my outward appearance and never sees me again will think something of me. The other person who walks past me will think a different thing, and we all have different observations. My parents will have an idea of who I am, which may not be the same as how I feel I am. My friends, we all have different ideas of who I am. So either that means that there are infinite versions of myself based on everybody's opinion of me, or that there is one true self that none of us really know, but there is this concept of me. Or if not, if there's not an infinite number, or there's not one true self, it means that there is no such thing as a self, and the self is very much a fluid concept that never really takes shape. And I think reading somebody like Pirandello, who's quite obsessed with selfhood, is quite a good thing to do if you ever go through an existential period or a quarter life crisis. One, because he does help you to think about what it means to be you, but also because at times you think it's quite ludicrous to be that obsessed with identity and existence. And sometimes it can help you snap out of your existential crisis because you don't quite want to fall into the trap that his protagonists are falling into. So I definitely recommend him. And I think there are some good translations out there. But Pirandello is definitely a writer of the 20th century that I think should be on anybody's list if they're trying to enter into Italian literature.
talking about sort of Italian literature and the language, obviously, Robin, am I right in saying that you speak Italian
Yes.
fluently?
Yeah.
So why do you think then learning languages is important, even in this sort of ever-growing world of technology and Google Translate and things such as that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think also because if I'm not wrong in saying this, the two of you are also
Yeah,
linguists
so
in your own right.
we're both doing a language for A level. I'm doing Spanish, and John is doing French.
Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, exactly. So you'll probably agree with some of the things I say, and if you have anything you want to say whilst I'm speaking, obviously just jump in because I think this is a very interesting thing for the three of us. But I suppose to begin with, I'd say that languages are important because going back, for example, to my comment about how humans are creative, we're also communicative beings. We need to communicate. That's a whole part of who we are. We're social beings. And language, at its very essence, is communication. Now, technology, whilst it's advancing language learning in many ways, and it can be very useful for businesses and so on, isn't, in my opinion, ever going to threaten, or it shouldn't threaten, the importance of languages. Because for any actual linguist, anybody who cares about languages, I would say 99% of them aren't doing it for a commercial reason. They're doing it for a personal gain. They're doing it to be able to go to a country and make friends. They're doing it to be able to investigate literature that they couldn't do without the language. They're doing it to get to know themselves better because you may agree or you may not, but I completely agree with the idea that when you learn another language, it opens up a new part of your
Yeah,
own identity. You are able to think in a different way to before. You're able to wrestle with ideas that you weren't necessarily aware of. And language learning isn't just about words and verbs, it's not nouns, verbs, conjugations. It's also ideas and culture. You can't learn a language without dipping your toe into the culture of the nation that you're engaging with. I wouldn't have been able to learn Italian or French without knowing a thing or two about Italy and France. So I think that language learning is important just as much as anything for a personal sort of benefit. I don't know if you've got anything to say on that, but you guys next year will be doing your A levels. You'll be learning a lot of language, sure. There'll be moments where you're studying your grammar, but a whole large part of the A level, which maybe differentiates it from the GCSE, is that you'll have to study a novel or a play and a film. And that side of language learning for me is the most exciting part because that's when you're really touching with another culture and really sort of going beyond what is expected maybe of an a young English person in the 21st century. It's a shame that being abroad, everybody has a belief that English people are arrogant and don't learn languages. And unfortunately, that stereotype is true. Stereotypes come from somewhere. But it's nice to see that people like you, like me, and many of your friends, I'm sure, are interested in learning another language because it isn't just about advancing business, or it isn't just about making money from being able to walk into a boardroom and speak another language. It's so much more about becoming a sort of more worldly person,
yeah,
in
I
my opinion.
totally agree with everything you said there. I think not only does it open up a sort of professional perspective, but you also get an insight into. So, for example, me learning another language helps my own mother tongue. I've found, and also I
Yeah,
think you've got, although you're the same person, you've got a bit of a different personality in a different language. So you're more loud. You speak loud. I think especially Latin languages. I'm sure you can agree with me here.
yeah,
It's you're a bit more excited when you're speaking. You tend to speak a bit on the louder spectrum for some unknown reason.
absolutely. And I think it's interesting, you get louder, but you also lose some of your characteristic English traits. I mean, English people are more reserved, as you've alluded to, than Spanish people or Italian people or other, Europeans. But when you're speaking, or at least when I'm speaking Italian, that sort of reserved nature does at least diminish without me even realizing it, because you can't really fully speak Italian if you're not pretending in a way to be Italian. You can't speak French if you're not sort of taking on a bit of a French personality. And I think it's quite nice almost as a way of escaping yourself, and it's a fun experience. Language learning can be fun, and it should be fun. And as much as anything, this year I've made plenty of friends because of the fact that I can speak the language, and it opens up so many opportunities just for socializing, which I think is so exciting, especially whilst in today's day and age we can socialize with many people using our phone, and we can sort of avoid the issues of translation thanks to things like DeepL. But that's not very human to be just relying on technology. And if you want to socialize, you can't be pulling up your phone and having conversations with Google Translate. You can communicate in a cafe like that, but you're not going to make any friendships by doing so. And I think the fact that you're both taking on languages alongside your other studies is just it. It's good. It's very promising for future generations. I think it's good that technology isn't the only priority. Even if people are studying computer sciences and things like that, it would also be nice to study another language alongside it.
Yes, I totally agree with you there because, especially for me, like initially language learning, it was about sort of verbs and nouns. But as I've grown older, with my interest in like history, politics, literature, they've all sort of contributed to my French.
Yeah,
So that I've become more interested in not just the French language as in words, but more of, as you said, like the idea of French or the French
yeah,
culture.
absolutely. And as you suggested earlier, it also helps your own language. If you get interested in etymologies, that helps you understand English better. If you're trying to understand why a word is how it is, that helps you understand English. If you understand another language's grammar, that helps you understand English better. And like you've just said now, knowing French as an example, taking French as an example, if you go into history and study the French Revolution as another example, you can have access to so many more archival resources than the person who doesn't. And from an academic point of view, that's a real weapon that you can use. I think we could all go on talking about languages for so long because there are just so many benefits. I mean, not to mention the fact that it's uh, suggested to be a way of combating Alzheimer's, as an example. There are so many things that languages do for us that people all too easily ignore, especially in the UK. And I understand why people maybe aren't pushed into speaking languages, because the idea that everybody in the world speaks English is quite weighs quite heavily on people's mind. But the simple fact is that that isn't true. There are 7, 8 billion people in the world, and fewer than 2 billion people speak English. Now, that's still a lot of people do, but you can't rely on it. And even if you're speaking to somebody who speaks English, if you go to Japan and somebody there speaks English, if you speak to them in their native tongue, even if it's just a polite please, thank you, whatever it may be, it's just polite, it's courtesy, it's respectful. And I think language learning allows us to be polite to other people and to just get over our own arrogance and self entitlement
Yeah,
in
I
many ways.
think definitely so. Me being Romanian, I think learning English was more of a necessity than a hobby. But I think once you learn one, it's a lot easier to learn another. It just goes because you
Yeah,
get learning a language. I think is very mathematical in a way, but it's very different for very different people. But once you know what you need to do, then it becomes easier and easier. So moving on to the
absolutely.
next segment, which is about Italian culture and Italian life. Could you tell us one city in Italy we should all visit, and also one thing about Italian life that you think should be adopted by the UK?
Okay, great question. Because I could go off and list the typical cities that everybody would visit, Rome, Florence, Venice, and you should visit all of them. I'm not denying that. They're beautiful. But I think people wouldn't necessarily think to visit cities like Naples or Turin or Palermo. And I would be inclined to say any of those cities that aren't really on the tourist map are well worth visiting because you're going to get a more authentic feel of the city. It's not polluted by tourists. It's not sort of you hear in the street Italian as opposed to English. So I'm living in Turin right now, so a bit of a bias. I would definitely suggest that people visit Turin. It's a beautiful city. It's in the very north of Italy, near to the French border. And in that respect, it has a few French influences in the architecture. And many people have suggested that the way in which the city is structured is reminiscent of Paris. But it's also very Italian. And it was actually the first capital of Italy when Italy was unified. And with that in mind, it's got a long history. It's got so many incredible museums and galleries that you can visit. But there's so much to do, but nobody visits. And so when you're walking down the street, you don't feel that it's a tourist city. Now, for some people, that could be quite terrifying. Some people need to know that there are other tourists. And I respect that if that's, how you feel as a traveler or as a tourist. But if you're somebody who wants to really feel like you're engaging with the country that you're visiting, I would suggest that people visit the cities that aren't on the tourist map. Naples being another one because whilst you do get tourists coming on the cruises there, you get far fewer than you would in other cities. And also Naples is a city that is just alive. In Italy, the general view is that Neapolitans are wild people who disobey societal expectations. Whether or not that's true or not is for you to decide. But that seems to be the Italian idea of Naples. And when you visit the city, you can kind of see why that idea exists. It's a city that is unlike any other I've ever been to. It's definitely unlike any other Italian city. And I think that's why I would suggest people go there because you're going to get an authentic experience. Now, if you want to go to Rome, Florence, Venice, Milan, obviously go for it. They are well worth seeing, and there's so much to do there. But you just have to be aware that it's going to be a tourist trap a lot of the time. And if you want to avoid the tourist trap, Turin, Naples, Catania, Palermo, they're places that I would suggest.
And perhaps moving on to our final question then, what are your views on sort of the current political situation in Italy? So, as many of our listeners will know, it's obviously dominated by Giorgia Meloni and the sort of far right Brothers of Italy party.
Yeah, and it's definitely something that people are discussing at the moment in Italy. Most of the people that I've spoken to are very much fearful of what might happen. They're against Meloni, but it has to be said that that's an opinion that is being spoken of in Turin, which is first and foremost, it's a city. Cities tend to have different views on Meloni to the rural areas, as is often the case in politics. Different different areas have different views, especially cities tend to stand apart from towns and villages. But also, Turin has quite a working class history and is probably historically left or left of centre. So Meloni is quite terrifying here. But if you were to go to other parts of Italy, she's worshipped as a hero, and even here, there are people who worship her as a hero. Now, what's very interesting is that she's almost created a personal brand. She goes by Giorgia, not Giorgia Meloni. She just goes by Giorgia. In all the posters, it tells you to vote for Giorgia, which is a bit like Boris going by Bojo. It's a way of standing out. Now, that's something that in Italy, these sort of personal brands have existed before with the likes of Berlusconi, who completely swept the Italian political map. Everybody in Italy is aware of Berlusconi's history and his past. What's maybe concerning about Meloni, which wasn't as concerning about Berlusconi, even though people would certainly raise many concerns about him, is that she seems quite unashamedly ready to talk about things that can relate to the fascist past of Italy. And a lot of people draw the similarities between her party and fascism. Now, that's something that in Italy you can understand people don't want to feel coming back. But there are obviously some people who are quite happy for that to return. And the policies that are maybe most concerning to the people I've spoken to are her pretty firm stances on immigration, her views on, you know, gay marriage, her views on all sorts of different things, the EU as an example, and maybe just the fear that Italy's becoming a bit too focused on nationalism and may lose its global importance as it becomes more and more insular. And I think whilst there does exist, a rival party or rival parties, Meloni's government, the Brothers of Italy, are very, very much under the spotlight, and everybody knows about them. Everybody talks about them, and it's just definitely something that young people in particular are a bit scared of because the fascist government wasn't even 100 years ago, and the fact that we're leaning back towards that over here in Italy is scary. It's something that people thought would have been part of the past. Um, so I think, like with many European countries at the moment, this is something that is a key topic of debate. And I know that your podcast talks a lot about politics and things such as that. I listened to your one on Trump the other day to do with his assassination attempt. It's definitely worth talking about why it is that Italy is veering towards its fascist past again, something that for so many years it's tried to steer away from. Why should Italians be accepting of the fact that this is happening again? Not all Italians, obviously, but enough are that it's actually becoming a
Yes, I
concern for a lot
think
of
there's
people.
definitely a current right now in mainland Europe um,
Yeah.
Yeah,
leaning to the right. I think the left hasn't really delivered, I don't think, in a way that a lot of people are disappointed and are looking for this sort of hero that doesn't really exist. But these parties are arguing that they are this hero. And in the UK right now,
yeah,
we've got actually a very different situation with the left having a landsliding victory.
Yeah.
Um,
of course.
but yes, I would like to thank you, Robin, for coming with us today. It's been a hugely fascinating discussion for all of us.
Yes,
And
and thank you, Robin. It's been great to have you on. A new, fresh perspective, as well as sort of helping the podcast start to talk about things like art and literature, which we haven't really dabbled into previously.
no, thank you to both of you. It's been really interesting to talk to you, and it's exciting to see that the two of you, just having finished GCSEs, are already talking about such mature topics with sort of a very erudite lens. It's really impressive, and I feel really privileged to have been part of this
Thank you
team.
very much. And as always, we hope that you liked the podcast. And if you did, please do go back and listen to our previous episodes. We have an emergency podcast on Trump, as well as discussing other European and international affairs recently. Thank you.
Thank you.